North Atlantic, March 1943. The sea is calm, unnervingly calm. Beneath the black surface, U-boat U-404 glides silently through the depths, hunting for Allied convoys. Inside the steel tube, red lights glow faintly. The air is thick with diesel fumes and sweat. Every man moves with careful precision, trained, confident, sure of their invisibility. The commander leans over the hydrophone operator. Any sound? Nothing, Herr Kalun. Ocean's quiet. Then a faint ping, barely audible, like a drop of water in a cave. One, then another, then another. The crew exchange nervous glances. The commander stiffens. What is that? Before anyone can answer, a deep rumble shakes the hull. The lights flicker. Another blast. Then another. Closer. Depth charges. The crew scrambles, shouting, sealing hatches, fighting to surface. But it's too late. The ocean swallows them whole. No distress signal, no trace. By sunrise, U-404 is gone. Just one of many German submarines disappearing into the Atlantic that spring. And for the first time, Berlin begins to wonder. What have the Allies discovered beneath the waves? In the opening years of World War II, the Atlantic Ocean became the single most vital lifeline of the war. Every bullet, every tank, every ration of food Britain needed to survive, all had to cross that cold, unforgiving stretch of sea. The German Kriegsmarine knew this, and they believed they could choke Britain into submission, not through direct invasion, but through starvation. At the center of their plan stood the U-boat, the silent killer of the deep. When war broke out in September 1939, Germany possessed only a small fleet of operational submarines. But under the leadership of Admiral Karl Donitz, that would change with alarming speed. Donitz visioned a war not of grand fleets, but of invisible predators. Dozens of U-boats working in wolf packs, coordinating attacks on Allied convoys through radio signals. At first, it worked. It worked too well. By early 1941, the Atlantic had become a graveyard of Allied shipping. British merchant losses climbed into the thousands of tons each month. Convoys vanished without warning. Survivors told haunting stories of torpedoes appearing from nowhere, of ships torn apart in seconds. Then, silence. To many Germans, the U-boat arm became a symbol of technical superiority, the ultimate weapon of a disciplined, precise nation. Propaganda posters showed clean-cut sailors smiling confidently beside their steel machines. Newspapers boasted of tonnage sunk and the cowardice of British escort ships. Deep within the command centers in Paris and Kiel, Donitz's officers reviewed reports with quiet satisfaction. Their calculations were clear. If they could sink more shipping than the Allies could build, Britain would eventually collapse. But beneath that confidence lay arrogance and ignorance. For even as the U-boats prowled the Atlantic unchecked, the Royal Navy and Allied scientists were working tirelessly in silence. They knew that brute force could not win this war. The answer, they believed, lay in detection, in hearing what the human ear could not. It was not new technology. In fact, the British had experimented with an early form of underwater detection since the end of World War I. It was called ASDIC, a primitive sonar system that sent out sound pulses and listened for echoes bouncing off submerged submarines. By 1940, the Royal Navy had installed ASDIC on hundreds of escort ships. But it was unreliable, clumsy in rough seas, easily fooled by currents, and nearly useless when U-boats attacked on the surface at night. And so the Germans laughed. Reports of sound waves tracking submarines were dismissed as Allied propaganda, desperate tales from a navy that had already lost control of the Atlantic. In the bars of Lorient and Sut-Nazaire, German officers joked that the British fight with bubbles. To them, sonar was a fantasy. Their own intelligence unit studied Allied technology and concluded it posed no serious threat. German doctrine focused instead on stealth, on silent running, and on the deadly coordination of their wolf packs. But by 1942, subtle changes were happening. Small at first, almost invisible. Convoys that had once been easy targets now fought back. Patrol aircraft appeared where there had been none. And most alarming of all, some U-boats simply didn't come home. At first, Donuts believed it was bad luck or mechanical failure, but the losses grew too consistent, too frequent, too similar. Submarines vanished in mid-transmission. Distress signals were cut off mid-word. Something, or someone, was finding them. And though the German High Command didn't know it yet, the Battle of the Atlantic was quietly shifting beneath the surface. The hunters were about to become the hunted. By 1941, Britain stood on the edge of collapse. German U-boats had cut off vital supplies from America and Canada, and every crossing of the Atlantic became a deadly gamble. Each week, merchant captains gathered in Liverpool, waiting for their turn to sail. Many never returned. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't just a military campaign, it was survival itself. Churchill would later write that the only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. And he meant it. The Royal Navy's surface fleet, once the pride of the Empire, was helpless against the unseen enemy beneath the waves. Destroyers and corvettes could patrol endlessly, dropping depth charges where they thought submarines might be. But it was guesswork, blind, and often futile. In the shadow of this crisis, science was drafted into service. Britain's most brilliant physicists, engineers, and mathematicians, many pulled from universities and private labs, were thrown into wartime research. Their task? Make sound the weapon that could save Britain. At the heart of this effort stood the humble ASDIC, a technology born in theory, but not yet perfected in battle. It worked like an underwater echo, sending out pulses of sound, then listening for the return. But the challenge was complexity. The ocean was full of false echoes, temperature layers, and unpredictable currents that confused the signal. The early operators were frustrated, exhausted, often mocked by their own commanders. One sailor described his ASDIC set as a stubborn box that lies more than it speaks. But in small, isolated trials, off the coast of Scotland and in the deep channels near Newfoundland, something extraordinary began to happen. When conditions were calm and operators were trained properly, the sound beams found their mark. The echo returned, faint, unmistakable, metallic. And when the ships dropped depth charges directly onto that contact, the results were conclusive. Wreckage surfaced. Oil slicks spread across the water. And for the first time, British sailors knew what it felt like to strike back. This success was still rare, unreliable, but it ignited hope. By 1942, the British were joined by a new ally with vast resources and scientific muscle, the United States. Together, the Allies pooled their efforts, sharing designs, data, and scientists in one of the most remarkable collaborations of the war. At Harvard and MIT, American engineers began building improved sonar sets that could detect submarines at greater ranges and through rougher seas. The British provided real-world experience from the Atlantic convoys, what worked, what failed, and how U-boats behaved. The result was a new generation of sonar systems, faster, clearer, and deadly accurate when combined with new depth charge tactics. Yet the Germans still refused to believe it. Their naval intelligence continued to report that Allied sonar technology was too crude to track a moving submarine. They saw sonar little more than an annoyance, a noise in the distance, easily escaped with a change of depth or course. But the Allies weren't just improving sonar, they were building an entire ecosystem around it. Radar-equipped aircraft now scouted the surface at night. Escort carriers carried small planes that could spot periscopes, and every convoy had a screen of escort ships whose sonar operators listened constantly, hour after hour, for the faintest echo of danger.
By the end of 1942, the tables were turning. Convoys that once lost 10 ships might now lose only one. And deep beneath the waves, German commanders began to sense a shift they couldn't explain. The ocean, once their safest ally, had turned against them. And soon they would learn that what they had dismissed as British noise was in fact the sound of their own destruction, the rhythmic ping of Allied sonar, zeroing in on their position, one pulse at a time. The Atlantic was changing. The invisible war had begun.
For the Germans, the sea had always been a place of order, a chessboard ruled by discipline and precision. Their submariners were the elite of the Kriegsmarine, hand-picked, meticulously trained, and bonded by an almost spiritual faith in their machines. Each U-boat was a masterpiece of German engineering, tight, efficient, unforgiving. Its crew lived by routine, every movement measured, every command unquestioned. They believed no enemy could match their craftsmanship, no weapon could threaten them beneath the waves. That belief became their weakness. By 1942, the U-boat force had grown to over 200 active submarines. The Atlantic was divided into patrol grids, each meticulously tracked by Dernitz's headquarters in occupied France. The German strategy relied on one assumption, that the ocean was vast and silent enough to hide them. But sonar changed everything. To the Allies, the ocean was no longer empty. It was alive, full of sound. For decades, scientists had known that the sea carried vibrations better than air. A propeller blade, a torpedo launch, even the hum of a motor could travel for miles underwater. What the British and Americans discovered was that these sounds could be measured, interpreted, and weaponized. The Germans, however, dismissed such ideas. They trusted steel, not science. Their engineers focused on improving hull strength, engine efficiency, and torpedo accuracy, the visible mechanics of war. They built submarines that could dive deeper, travel farther, and strike harder. But they underestimated the power of invisible detection. It wasn't arrogance alone. In the early years, Allied sonar really was weak. ASDIC could detect a submarine only if it was directly ahead, moving slowly and within a narrow range. To U-boat captains, this was laughable, like trying to hear a whisper in a storm. So the Germans never adapted. They made no serious effort to reduce noise or alter propeller designs. Their training manuals barely mentioned sound discipline beyond basic quiet running procedures. Meanwhile, the Allies were learning. Every lost ship became a lesson. Every sonar contact, a data point. Each convoy battle refined their understanding of how submarines moved, how echoes bounced, and how depth charges could be timed to detonate precisely where a U-boat would try to hide. It was methodical, scientific, deadly. The German commanders didn't understand how their positions were being found so quickly. Some suspected spies, others blamed faulty equipment or bad weather. Few considered that the Allies could actually see them underwater. There was another advantage the Allies held, one that no machine could replicate: communication. While the Germans prided themselves on strict radio discipline, their system was rigid and predictable. The Wolfpack strategy relied on radio transmissions between submarines and headquarters, signals that could be intercepted, triangulated, and eventually used against them. The Allies combined these signals with sonar and radar data to create a complete picture of the ocean battlefield. For the first time in naval history, war was being fought in 3 dimensions: surface, sky, and sea,
connected by invisible technology. And while German submariners continued to trust their instincts and engineering, the Allies were trusting something else: mathematics, data, and the strange new science of sound. By 1943, the difference was visible and terrifying. Where once Allied ships fled in panic, now they turned to attack. Where once the U-boat was the hunter, it was now the hunted. And somewhere in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, beneath the roar of destroyer propellers and the rhythmic ping of sonar, German captains began to realize that their greatest strength, their silence, had become meaningless. The ocean was no longer theirs alone.
Admiral Karl Donitz ruled his underwater empire with absolute authority. To his men, he was more than a commander. He was a father figure, a strategist, and a believer in destiny. His U-boat arm, the U-boat Waffe, was his creation, disciplined, efficient, and loyal to the core. But like many architects of powerful systems, Donitz saw the world through his own success. He believed that human skill, training, and willpower could outmatch any technological trick. He was wrong. At his headquarters in occupied France, massive wall maps displayed the North Atlantic in a grid of squares. Each U-boat was represented by a tiny marker, its last known position reported via encrypted radio. Every day, Donitz and his staff tracked their movements, waiting for contact reports, torpedo hits, and the triumphant signals that began with "Feind versenkt," enemy sunk. But by late 1942, the messages changed. Under attack. Depth charges, damage severe. Then, silence. The pins on the wall disappeared faster than replacements could be launched. At first, Donitz refused to believe it was sonar. He suspected Allied aircraft or new radar systems. He blamed poor crew discipline. He even considered sabotage. But the evidence grew undeniable. Entire wolf packs were being destroyed, not just damaged, but wiped out with surgical precision. In the claustrophobic world of a U-boat, morale began to crack. These men, once the pride of Germany, were living in constant fear. Their missions stretched for weeks, sometimes months, in total isolation. They could no longer surface safely. Allied aircraft prowled the skies day and night. Below, the ocean had turned hostile, filled with invisible sound waves and the deadly echo of sonar pings. Veterans recalled the sound vividly. A slow, rhythmic pulse that grew faster, sharper, until the first explosion shattered the silence. It was the sound of death approaching. Many U-boat captains described the terror of being hunted, the relentless chase lasting hours, sometimes days. Depth charges rolled down the water like thunderclaps, each detonation shaking the steel hull, bursting pipes and cutting lights. Crewmen would clutch the walls, praying the next explosion didn't tear them apart. And all the while, their enemy remained unseen. Above the surface, Allied coordination was becoming an art form. American and British escort captains learned to communicate instantly. Sonar operators calling bearings, gunners setting depth charges, aircraft above marking oil slicks and periscope wakes. They trusted data, not instinct. They trusted teamwork over individual heroism. This was the fundamental difference between the two sides. Donitz's system rewarded obedience, not adaptation. His captains followed doctrine, not innovation. And when that doctrine failed, they had nothing left to fall back on. In contrast, Allied naval commanders encouraged flexibility.
If one tactic failed, they changed it within hours. When sonar struggled with surface noise, scientists modified the frequency. When U-boats began diving deeper, engineers developed new hedgehog launchers that fired multiple contact bombs in patterns, detonating only upon direct hit, far deadlier and more efficient than traditional depth charges. It was a partnership of minds. Sailors, scientists, and strategists working together in a way the Germans never matched. Even the Americans, newcomers to submarine warfare, adapted quickly. Their industrial might allowed them to mass-produce sonar sets, escort ships, and anti-submarine weapons faster than Germany could replace its losses. Every improvement in Allied technology was magnified by sheer scale. By 1943, the numbers spoke for themselves. In 1 month alone, May 1943, the Germans lost 41 U-boats, nearly one every day. For Dönitz, it was a nightmare. He called it the blackest month of the U-boat war. Behind his calm exterior, he understood the truth. Germany had lost control of the Atlantic. But Hitler still demanded results, and the propaganda machine continued to boast of victories that no longer existed. For the men trapped in those steel coffins beneath the sea, the reality was far darker. They were no longer hunters. They were prey, stalked by an enemy that could hear their every move. The age of the U-boat ace was over. The age of invisible warfare had begun. And at its heart was a single sound, a sound the Germans once laughed at, the soft, relentless ping of Allied sonar.
Spring 1943. The North Atlantic had changed. What had once been a hunting ground for Germany's U-boats was now a killing field, but not for the Allies. Convoys that once sailed in fear now steamed with quiet confidence. Every ship was shielded by a wall of sound and vigilance. Destroyers ahead, corvettes on the flanks, aircraft overhead. They were no longer blind. They could hear everything. At the heart of this transformation was a convergence of innovation: sonar, radar, and coordination. The British called it the integration of detection. It began with new escort carriers, small, flat-topped ships carrying a handful of aircraft capable of scouting hundreds of miles around a convoy. Using radar, they could detect a surfaced U-boat at night, the very tactic that had once made submarines unstoppable. When a contact was made, the aircraft would attack with rockets or depth charges, forcing the U-boat to dive directly into the sonar nets of waiting destroyers. The moment the submarine submerged, the next phase began. Sonar operators aboard escort ships pressed their headphones tight, listening for the faintest echo. One operator later recalled, "It began as a soft ping, then a returning beat, steady, strong, metallic. You knew you had them." Within seconds, the coordinates were passed through the convoy screen. Multiple ships converged, attacking in calculated rhythm, one circling wide, another closing in from astern, each dropping depth charges at precise depth intervals. The sea exploded. Columns of water erupted skyward as explosions tore through the depths. Inside the trapped U-boat, chaos reigned. Men shouted over the roar of rupturing pipes. Bulbs burst, gauges shattered. The commander tried to level the submarine, ballast tanks groaning, but the pressure was too great. In the blackness, the hull began to buckle. Then came the final scream of twisting metal and silence. Another U-boat destroyed. Another crew gone without a trace. For the Allies, this wasn't just revenge. It was justice.
For 3 years, the Atlantic had been a graveyard of civilian sailors and merchantmen. Now, at last, they were striking back. And behind the sound of explosions was the quiet hum of Allied science. Men in lab coats in London, Washington, and Ottawa, who had turned physics into a weapon. Their work had produced new sonar frequencies that could penetrate thermoclines, layers of warm and cold water that once distorted echoes. They refined signal amplifiers so sensitive they could detect the difference between a whale and a submarine. They even trained operators to identify specific propeller patterns. Each U-boat had its own distinct signature. The Germans had no counter. Even as Dönitz pushed his engineers for solutions, new coatings, decoys, or silent motors, the Allies advanced faster. In 1943, a new weapon appeared, the Hedgehog. Unlike depth charges, which detonated at set depths, Hedgehog projectors launched dozens of small contact bombs ahead of the ship. They only exploded when they struck a solid target, which meant that a single successful attack left no doubt. The result was devastating accuracy. U-boats, once able to evade by diving deep or turning sharply, were now struck dead on. In convoy after convoy, the pattern repeated: detection, pursuit, destruction. The once mighty wolf packs were being slaughtered before they could strike. In one infamous battle, Convoy ONS-5 in May 1943, the tide truly turned. Nearly 50 U-boats were sent to intercept the 43-ship convoy. It should have been an easy kill, a textbook wolfpack attack. But Allied sonar operators, now seasoned and confident, held the line. With aircraft overhead and escorts coordinated by radar and sonar, the U-boats were driven off and hunted down. By the end of the engagement, 6 U-boats lay destroyed, others damaged beyond repair. For Dönitz, it was a catastrophe. The North Atlantic, once his domain, had become a death trap. His commander sent frantic reports: sonar detection unavoidable, no escape once located. They described the new Allied coordination as inhuman, as if the enemy could hear and see through the water itself. And in a way, they could. The sound waves bouncing through the ocean had become as lethal as any torpedo. By mid-1943, U-boat crews began calling the sonar the hammer of God. Every ping meant death was coming. Every echo meant the sea, once their shield, had betrayed them. The Battle of the Atlantic was entering its most decisive phase, and for the German U-boat force, the sound of defeat had a rhythm, steady, relentless, and unmistakable.
Summer 1943. The Battle of the Atlantic had turned into a massacre. For the first time, Admiral Karl Dönitz, the architect of Germany's U-boat empire, sat in silence. His once fearless wolves were dying faster than he could replace them. The numbers on his reports no longer made sense. 40, 50, 60 submarines lost in a matter of months. Each name crossed off meant 40 men gone, swallowed by the same ocean that had once been their ally. He had warned Berlin for months. The Allies are adapting. We are blind underwater. But few listened. Even now, the Nazi high command still spoke of total victory at sea. Yet Dönitz knew the truth. The Atlantic had become a graveyard for German sailors. The Allies had turned science into instinct. They had mastered the invisible. Night no longer offered protection. Radar pierced the darkness. Depth no longer provided safety. Sonar followed them down. Even silence failed, because the Allies had learned to predict the U-boat's patterns. The hunter had become the hunted. In ports like Lorient, Brest, and Saint-Nazaire, crews stepped aboard their U-boats knowing they might never return. Some men quietly packed letters home before every voyage, sealing them in envelopes marked, "For my wife, if I do not return." The sea was cold and unforgiving, but it was not as cruel as the waiting. Once they left the coast of France, the reality set in. The Allies were everywhere. Long-range patrol aircraft from Newfoundland to Iceland filled the skies. Their radar swept the waves, searching for the faint shadow of a conning tower. When a U-boat was sighted, flares illuminated the night like daylight. Depth charges followed, one after another, until oil, debris, and bodies rose to the surface. Some U-boats tried to escape beneath the thermal layers, but new sonar technology penetrated even that refuge. Others attempted silent running, cutting engines and drifting through the depths, hoping to outlast the destroyers above. But the Allies had patience and fuel. They could wait for hours, even days, and when the U-boat's oxygen finally thinned, it would be forced to rise. The moment it surfaced, aircraft swooped in, rockets striking before the crew could even open the hatches. By late 1943, Donitz received a chilling message from one of his commanders. "Enemy has ears beneath the sea. We cannot hide." In May alone, Germany lost 43 submarines. That was nearly a third of its active U-boat force, gone in just 1 month. The morale collapsed faster than the fleet. Crews started calling the Atlantic the Black Coffin. Men refused to sail. Some broke down during training, haunted by the screams of exploding hulls. Donitz, ever the soldier, tried to remain defiant. He ordered improvements, quieter engines, new anti-sonar coatings, decoy buoys that emitted false echoes. But by the time those reached the front, it was too late. The Allies were years ahead. They had introduced a new weapon, sonobuoys. Dropped from aircraft, these floating microphones could listen for submarines over vast stretches of ocean. Now, even the air was listening. A U-boat could no longer sneak between convoys or attack under cover of storms. Every movement was heard, every escape predicted. By the end of 1943, Allied convoys could cross the Atlantic with minimal losses. The very convoys that once bled Britain dry were now arriving with food, fuel, and tanks in numbers that no blockade could stop. Donitz watched the reports come in with growing despair. U-boat command no longer dictates the tempo, one admiral admitted. The sea, once ruled by steel and torpedoes, now belonged to mathematics, sound waves, and patience. In September, Donitz issued an unprecedented order, the temporary withdrawal of all U-boats from the North Atlantic. For the first time since 1939, the wolf packs were gone. It was a silent admission of defeat. Thousands of sailors were dead. The once celebrated U-boat badge, once a mark of elite service, had become a symbol of doom. Even Hitler, who once praised Donitz as the master of the sea war, turned his attention elsewhere. The U-boat campaign was no longer a strategy, it was a suicide mission. In a letter written to his wife in late 1943, one German captain confessed, "We have no chance now. The enemy hears our heartbeat. The ocean itself betrays us." And so, as 1943 turned into 1944, the Atlantic fell silent. No more wolf packs prowled the dark waters. The convoys now sailed almost unchallenged, carrying men and machines that would soon storm Normandy's beaches. The sonar, the weapon the Germans once dismissed as childish science, had changed the war. Where once the ocean had been the U-boat's fortress, it had now become their tomb. And above it all, the sonar pings continued, echoing through the deep. A cold, mechanical requiem for thousands of lost men and the empire they served. Ping, ping, silence.
By early 1944, the Atlantic had transformed from a battlefield
into a graveyard. The once proud German U-boat fleet, 1,162 submarines strong at its height, was now reduced to wreckage scattered across the ocean floor. Each wreck told the same story: brave men, skilled officers, and an empire that refused to believe the enemy could outthink them. The Kriegsmarine's proud doctrine of Unterseebootkrieg, submarine warfare, had been broken not by brute force, but by sound. Sonar had done what bombs and bullets could not. It stripped the U-boat of its greatest weapon: invisibility. The statistics told a brutal truth. By the end of 1943, over 70% of active U-boats had been destroyed. More than 28,000 sailors, out of 40,000 who served, were dead. That meant 7 out of every 10 men who stepped aboard a German submarine never returned home. No other branch of the German military suffered losses on that scale. In the small coastal towns of northern Germany, Kiel, Wilhelmshaven, Hamburg, black flags fluttered over doorways. Wives waited for letters that never came. Mothers received telegrams marked "Vermisst auf See," missing at sea. At first, Berlin tried to conceal the scale of the disaster. Propaganda reels still showed U-boats slicing through calm seas, captains smiling, crews waving from conning towers. But by mid-1944, the illusion collapsed. Too many submarines had vanished. Too many families had buried empty coffins. Inside the Kriegsmarine, morale crumbled. Veterans of the early campaigns, those who once hunted convoys with pride, now refused promotions. Younger recruits, barely 18, were rushed through training and sent to sea with only a few weeks of experience. Most never made it back. Even Dönitz, once hailed as der Löwe der See, the Lion of the Sea, began to lose faith. He had built an empire on the idea that courage and willpower could overcome technology. Now he faced a war where courage meant little. For every new U-boat launched, the Allies had a dozen new sonar-equipped ships waiting. For every German innovation, a new torpedo, a new coating, the Allies countered within weeks. The technological race was over. The Allies had won it by mastering the one thing the Germans underestimated: sound itself. In London, the scientists behind ASDIC and Sonar were now national heroes, though few knew their names. They worked in underground labs surrounded by charts, oscilloscopes, and listening equipment. Their work was quiet, methodical, almost invisible. Yet through their invisible war, thousands of sailors' lives were saved. British escort groups began to refer to sonar as their sixth sense. Destroyer captains swore they could feel when a U-boat was near even before the pings confirmed it. And when the sound returned, that distinct echo, it meant one thing: another submarine found, another threat removed. The Allies' victory in the Atlantic didn't just keep Britain alive, it opened the road to D-Day. Without control of the Atlantic, there would have been no invasion of Normandy, no landing craft, no American troops crossing safely from New York to Plymouth. Sonar didn't just win a battle, it won the logistics war. Every tank, every ration crate, every aircraft part, all crossed the Atlantic under the silent protection of sound waves bouncing through the deep. Meanwhile, at the bottom of that same ocean, thousands of U-boats lay entombed, rusting, broken, but eerily preserved by the cold. Decades later, divers would find them, twisted steel skeletons resting in the dark, their decks covered in coral, their periscopes still pointed upward, as if still watching. Some even found personal relics, helmets, coffee mugs, journals sealed in rusted compartments. Time had turned them into underwater museums of pride and loss. For surviving U-boat veterans, the defeat was more than military. It was spiritual. They had believed they were invincible, that their discipline, precision, and courage were unmatched. But they had been defeated by something they could not see or hear until it was too late. And in that realization lay the bitter lesson of the Atlantic. In war, the most dangerous enemy is not the one with the biggest guns. It's the one who listens better. As 1944 progressed, Allied dominance of the seas became complete. The convoys moved freely, supplies poured into Britain. And while the armies of Europe prepared for the final push into occupied France, the sea, once the deadliest frontier, had fallen silent.
That silence would soon give birth to a new storm, one that would crash onto the beaches of Normandy. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the oceans were still haunted by echoes of war. The Battle of the Atlantic had lasted almost 6 years, the longest continuous campaign of the Second World War. And though it had been fought far from cities and headlines, its outcome decided the fate of the entire conflict. Without control of the seas, the Allies could never have brought America's industrial might to Europe. Without sonar, that control would have been impossible. In the post-war years, the world began to realize what had truly happened beneath the waves. The men of the Royal Navy and U.S. Navy who once sat for hours beside sonar screens, listening for faint whispers of danger, were now veterans of an invisible war. Their tools had evolved from crude pings to complex acoustic signatures, but the principle remained the same. Sound could reveal what sight could not. Navies around the world studied the Battle of the Atlantic with reverence. The lessons were clear. Victory no longer depended only on ships or guns, but on sensors, signals, and science. Germany's surviving engineers, once skeptical of Allied technology, were quietly recruited into post-war research. Some helped design the first generation of NATO sonar systems. Ironically, the same men who would dismiss sonar as impractical now devoted their careers to improving it. Meanwhile, sonar's influence spread far beyond warfare. It found new life in peace, mapping the ocean floor, tracking whales, studying underwater volcanoes. What was once a weapon of destruction became a tool of discovery. Yet for those who lived through it, the memories were not so easily transformed. In veterans' reunions across Europe, aging sailors would still fall silent when someone mentioned the pings. That sound, the heartbeat of the Atlantic War, never truly left them. It was the sound of hope for some and doom for others. A British escort sailor once described it in an interview decades later. Quote, "You'd sit there, eyes on the screen, headphones on. Then you'd hear it, that echo. You knew you'd found them. Or they'd found you." For the Germans, the memories carried heavier weight. Few U-boat veterans spoke openly about their missions. Those who did often described the loneliness, weeks submerged, trapped in steel, knowing that death could come from a sound too small to notice. One survivor, interviewed in the 1980s, said quietly, quote, "We weren't beaten by the Allies. We were beaten by sound." That truth haunted the entire Kriegsmarine legacy. The men had fought bravely, often with unmatched skill, but they were fighting a new kind of enemy, one that couldn't be seen or bombed. Their downfall wasn't cowardice or incompetence, it was progress. The sonar war had proven something profound. The future of conflict belonged to those who mastered information, not just firepower. After 1945, the Cold War began, and sonar technology became the silent front line once again. Nuclear submarines prowled the oceans, each equipped with advanced listening arrays capable of detecting ships from hundreds of miles away. The Atlantic, once filled with wolf packs, was now filled with machines listening to each other in a deadly silence. The lessons of the U-boat campaign were never forgotten. Every sonar operator, every submarine captain who came after, lived with that knowledge. No matter how deep you hide, the sea remembers. By the late 19th century, the wrecks of U-boats became memorials. Divers placed plaques beside them. Some were officially declared war graves, their crews resting undisturbed. The sonar that once hunted them now preserved their memory, helping historians locate and document their final resting places. And as the veterans of both sides aged, their stories became fewer, their voices quieter. But the echoes remained, carried not through the water, but through history. Today, sonar is standard equipment on every naval vessel, a quiet guardian built on decades of innovation and sacrifice. It stands as a reminder that the sea, for all its beauty, demands respect, and that progress in war often comes at the cost of those who believed they could not be defeated. The ocean still holds their bones, their courage and their pride, and the faint, eternal rhythm of those long-ago pings that changed the world forever. Ping. Ping. Silence. The war beneath the waves was unlike any other in history. It wasn't fought with glory or parades, but with whispers, echoes, and silence. The men who fought it never saw the enemy's face. He listened for him, through metal, through water, through fear. Every ping, every echo, every burst of sound carried the weight of survival. For the Allies, sonar was not just a technological triumph. It was proof that science could save lives, that knowledge could defeat terror. For the Germans, it was a lesson in humility, that even the mightiest machines and bravest crews could be undone by a sound too small to notice. When the last U-boat was sunk, the ocean didn't cheer, it simply went quiet again. But beneath that quiet lay a new understanding of war, that the future belonged to those who mastered information, not just firepower. Decades later, the world still hears echoes of that invisible struggle. Every modern submarine, every naval ship, every undersea exploration owes something to those early sonar pings that once guided destroyers through the fog of war. The men who served on both sides are now part of history, their courage sealed beneath the waves, their stories written in the language of silence. Yet their legacy endures in every ship that sails safely across the Atlantic, in every sonar pulse that guards the deep. The Battle of the Atlantic was not just a clash of navies. It was the moment when sound became sight, when science became strategy, and when technology changed the ocean forever. And somewhere far below the surface, those pings still echo, faint, steady, eternal. A heartbeat from another time, a reminder that even in the darkest depths, humanity always finds a way to listen. Ping. Ping. Silence.